I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 201st episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your own brain. As you know, if you were here from last week's episode, we are in the midst of a little departure from the normal format, doing something called the Cognito Awards, where we're looking back over the first 200 episodes, highlighting some special moments, some things worth knowing, and doing it in a modestly hokey format with apologies to the Oscar Awards, Emmys, and all the other award shows. But in last week's episode, we got the first 4 of these knocked off. We're going to do several more today. Then coming back to a Smart Drug Smarts format that you will recognize, interview-based, very soon. But today you're going to get more than a few interview segments. And following each one you hear, I'll also let you know which episode that came from. So if you want to dive back into the Smart Drug Smarts archive, that'll let you know where to aim your browser. Also going to give you a bit of something new in This Week in Neuroscience. The neuroscience news does not stop just because we're doing a special episode. So we will start things off that way right now.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So a couple of days ago, in what's going to be an upcoming Smart Drug Smarts episode, I was talking to a researcher who's doing studies into the possible therapeutic effects of ayahuasca. Any good scientific study, of course, you want to be aware of the potential for placebo effects and nocebo effects. What experimental results are coming more from a person's expectations than from the compound or the intervention that's being studied? You can imagine with ayahuasca how difficult it probably is to come up with an active placebo that is going to mimic those effects. But this is something that scientists appropriately put a lot of time into, trying to figure out just what they can expect to create a placebo effect, to create a nocebo effect, and what the magnitude of those effects might be. Nocebo, you might remember, is sort of the dark twin of placebo. It's when inert ingredients or something else that should have no effect whatsoever physiologically winds up having a negative impact on the subject of an experiment. By default, a placebo is sort of considered positive. When it swings the other way, it's called a nocebo. But scientists at the American Association for the Advancement of Science did some recent research, trying to better identify all the possible variables as they conduct clinical trials. And in a recent study, they gave 49 people a supposed anti-itch cream. This was actually a nocebo. This was an inactive ingredient, shouldn't do anything. But the participants were told that they might experience increased pain sensitivity, which they would then be asked about later. They were also wired up to a new fMRI method, which could simultaneously measure not just what was going on within their brain, but also their entire central pain system, which took measurements across the cortex, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. But in this study, there were no active ingredients, and what they were actually looking at, where their variable was the price of the therapy. Some participants received a cream that they were told was very expensive, whereas the others were told it was quite cheap. The scientists created 2 fake packages implying high and low price, and both the research subjects and the fMRI machines reported significant differences among the groups. There was actually a greater negative impact, so bigger nocebo effects among people that thought they were receiving an expensive treatment. So everyone was told you might be a little bit more pain sensitive. That was baloney, but then everybody was given a heat tolerance test that really just should have reported their baseline sensitivity. But the people that thought they were getting an expensive treatment, they reported more heat sensitivity than the people that thought it was less expensive. So higher levels of fake perceived side effects from expensive treatments. The 2 brain regions found to be involved in this based on the fMRI were the periaqueductal gray and the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, for those of you keeping score at home. So a couple different ways you could interpret this. You could think that people expect more of an expensive treatment and are maybe less forgiving of the side effects, even if they're imaginary side effects, or that a more expensive therapy is perceived to be stronger, and therefore the placebo or nocebo effects, good or bad, the dial gets turned up in the person's mind.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Bejesus from the USA says, great source for neurohacking, fantastic podcasts filled with information for those of us who love to geek out. And JRB Soccer 7, also from the USA, says, this podcast is amazing, always interesting and informative, and keeps my mind working at a sometimes dangerous pace. Well, hopefully not too dangerous. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to everybody that's left a review on iTunes or other places where one can review podcasts, including actual human conversations, which I know still take place on occasion. The complete subsumption of human society by the internet has long been predicted, but I got a feeling we're doing okay. I'm optimistic about such things. If you're looking for just a little more digital input, Smart Drug Smarts has a newsletter we call The Brain Breakfast. You can get signed up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And also want to give a big thank you to our couple of sponsors. We'll actually do this in non-alphabetical order this time. Put Vitamunk first, because Vitamunk is doing a big month-long contest for the month of October. They're calling this their October surprise. They're going to be giving away awards throughout the month. This is the first episode in the month of October, so I'm talking about it now. Their grand prize is a 1-year supply of any supplement that they carry, and there's a lot of things to choose from over there. They're also giving away a 6-month supply as a second prize, selecting winners weekly, so there's going to be people winning throughout the course of the month, and you can get signed up for that by going to smartdrugsmarts.com/October. Or if you're impatient, you can't wait to see if you win the contest, you can just head straight over to vitamunk.com. And in reverse alphabetical order, but still near and dear to my heart, a shout out to our second sponsor, Axon Labs, where we've got the stacks Nexus and Mitogen. Mitogen, a mitochondrial support stack loaded up with biochemical precursors and also an ingredient that promotes the growth of new mitochondria. Mitochondria, of course, being the microscopic power plants within each of your body's cells. And Nexus, a nootropic stack built around aniracetam, CDP choline, among other ingredients, all of them tightly targeted on the brain. And you can find both Nexus and Mitogen at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so getting back into the Cognito Awards, assuming that you caught last week's episode, you know what this is all about. We gave out 4 awards last week, 4 awards coming up. Those are the best dietary hack, the best physical vitality hack, the best endogenous cognitive performance hack. That's something that you can do without any tools, gear, or gadgetry, but still helps out your cognitive performance. And finally today, the best performance by technological gear. And that's what we got coming. So drum roll please, kazoos, etc.
Ladies and gentlemen, mice and microbes, please take your seats, adjust your earbuds, and return your prefrontal cortex to its full upright position. We are excited to present for your learning and entertainment the first ever Smart Drug Smarts Cognito Awards. Neuroscientists help us to understand what it means to be human. And in this podcast, we honor them. And now, your host for the Cognito Awards, a man who admits to occasionally being jealous of lab animals, founder of the Smart Drug Smarts podcast, Jesse Lawler.
Okay, settle down. Thank you. Let's get underway with our 5th Cognito Award, the first of this episode. Hippocrates famously said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." Now, as far as we know, no one ever said, "Let food be thy textbooks and a textbook be thy food." But there is every reason to believe that what we eat affects our thoughts and moods as much as it does our muscles and our waistlines. As much as a poor diet can leave you feeling bloated and in a cognitive coma, the right diet can get your stomach out of your mind's way while giving you the biochemical fuel to keep your ideas flowing.
In the category of Best Dietary Hack, the first nominee is Intermittent Fasting, presented by Mark Mattson.
If we look at peripheral markers of health like insulin sensitivity, both the time-restricted feeding, limiting food intake every day to 6 to 8 hours, and the several days a week more extensive fasting will increase insulin sensitivity about the same amount. And then the ketogenic diets will not increase circulating ketone levels as much as will occur with fasting. And one aspect of the high-fat diets that I think people would have to be careful about is they tend to be atherogenic, promote atherosclerosis. So in the long term, my own view is that it would be much healthier to be on an intermittent fasting diet than a diet where one is eating high fat.
And that was Dr. Mark Mattson from episode number 120.
The second nominee is Water Fasting, presented by Dr. Dominic D'Agostino.
I remember on day 7 of my 7-day fast, my brain felt really lucid. Actually, during that week, I wrote several grants and worked on manuscripts and just kind of stayed at home and just took it easy for the most part.
Yeah.
But during that time, I did feel more lucid, but I felt like on day 7, I was talking slower. I was almost slurring my speech. It's like I felt fine and I felt I could function. I even gave a lecture at the end and everything and felt perfectly fine, but I just felt like the whole energy system of my body were just kind of tuned down a little bit, and my body temperature was down about 1 to 2 degrees. And what was interesting to me as a diver, I was just sort of playing around in the pool, and I was like, let me test my breath hold time. And my breath hold time increased like over 100%. It was almost like 200% higher. I was able to hold my breath close to that of people who have a lot of training, and I had absolutely no training.
And that was Dr. Dominic D'Agostino in episode number 147.
The third nominee is Dietary Turmeric, presented by Matt Legg.
If you can get the fresh stuff that contains the volatile oils, or you look for extracts that are, for example, 95% curcuminoids with only 5% volatile oils preserved within the extract, and they will actually help the absorption of the turmeric back down to about equivalent to 1 gram a day of the fresh plant, is enough to actually get all the way into your brain. It gets everywhere in your body. And some of the effects of turmeric are insane, and it's just getting very, very popular. There's a lot of research coming onto it because they're finding some amazing effects on how it works as an antidepressant, anti-anxiety. The new research with its ability to help us regulate stress and all that sort of stuff, but some of its other weird little abilities to enhance the activity of other therapeutic compounds. When I see things like that, I go, now I know why cultural medicine will throw a little bit of turmeric into just about everything, because it makes other ingredients actually work better.
And when we think about turmeric, the Indian subcontinent is what comes to mind first, and they've got fairly oily foods a lot of the time, like a lot of ghee, which I imagine, even if the essential oil of the turmeric plant is long gone, just having that lipophilic nature of the compound, and there's a lot of fat in the food source, probably helps with that absorption.
Exactly. And a lot of the old Ayurvedic remedies used to start by boiling turmeric into ghee or into buffalo milk or something to actually help deliver the turmeric into the mucous membranes for asthma or sinus or whatever. Hey, one of the interesting things I've just discovered with turmeric, with omega-3, the vegan omega-3 oils that are often looked at as being not effective because they can't convert effectively through to EPA and DHA. What they've discovered with turmeric is it can actually activate the desaturase enzymes and increase the conversion of vegan omega-3 oils all the way through to EPA and DHA.
And that was Matt Legg from episode number 118.
The fourth nominee is Ketogenic Diet, presented by Dr. Dominic D'Agostino.
And then I discovered the Charlie Foundation. It's run by Jim Abrams. His son was Charlie. And he discovered the ketogenic diet and worked with Johns Hopkins Clinic and was able to get his son's seizures under control when no drug was able to do it. And he became a very vocal advocate of the ketogenic diet, arguing that it's grossly underutilized. And then I watched the movie by Meryl Streep called First Do No Harm. I never thought Meryl Streep did a movie about the ketogenic diet, and I watched this and I realized that this is for real. And I immediately went to PubMed and I just went down the rabbit hole and I read literally paper after paper for a couple weeks, and I put my hands up and I said, this is what I'm going to study. So I was like, okay, let's figure out what this diet is, optimize it, and maybe figure out some tricks where we can develop exogenous synthetic ketone molecules to further augment the therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet.
And that was Dr. Dominic D'Agostino again in episode number 147.
The fifth nominee is Dietary Chocolate, presented by Dr. Georgina Crichton.
There's been a lot of research done on the acute effects of chocolate, and particularly dark chocolate. So lots of researchers have examined, they'll give you a chocolate bar, typically dark chocolate, because dark chocolate is higher in flavonols than milk chocolate. They'll give you a piece of chocolate to consume and then immediately measure your cognitive function. So they'll test your memory and your ability to do different tasks. And they've shown that, yes, maybe there's an effect there, that consuming chocolate may have an immediate effect on your cognitive performance. We were interested in looking at the long term, so your normal intake, so not going out and eating, 3 bars of chocolate and seeing how well you do. We were interested in examining the normal diets of people, so whether what you eat on a normal day-to-day, weekly basis is associated with or what foods are associated with your cognitive function. And we decided to look at chocolate. So we took about 1,000 people from a study, the main Syracuse longitudinal study, and we looked at relationships between people's chocolate intake and their cognitive function. And the nice thing about it was it included all types of chocolate, so we didn't just focus on dark chocolate, which is where the majority of research has been done so far. And we showed that those people who did consume a small amount of chocolate at least once a week did perform significantly better than those who never or rarely ate chocolate.
And that was Dr. Georgina Crichton from episode 130. The envelope, please. And for Best Dietary Hack, the award goes to Intermittent Fasting, presented by Dr. Mark Mattson. As bilaterally symmetrical creatures, it might be natural that humans are obsessed with dualities, left and right, night and day, black and white. But our obsession with dividing the world into couplets led, probably inevitably, to creating an ideological division between mind and body, a division that's almost as imaginary as that between left and right. Because without a healthy, happy mind, a strong body is just a wasted vessel, and without a healthy body, the mind is at best a sputtering, inconstant flame, not one that can be trusted to enlighten anything. In the end, then, it turns out that keeping our bodies healthy isn't a distraction from cognition, but a prerequisite for it.
In the category of Best Physical Vitality Hack, the first nominee is Ketosis versus Cancer by Dr. Thomas Seyfried.
When you do fasting or ketogenic diets, what's the mechanism by which these approaches manage the disease? I mean, the question is, how is it so effective in reducing tumor size, targeting blood vessels, targeting inflammation, targeting all the aspects of cancer that the pharmaceutical field and the academic field are trying to develop drugs for? Yet this simple procedure can do the same thing in a more effective and less toxic way. So the question is, how does all this happen? And, years ago, Otto Warburg said the underlying cause of all cancer is insufficient respiration. And therefore, the cells must ferment. If the cells cannot respire like our normal cells can, in order for the cell to remain alive, it must have an alternative form of energy, which is the primitive form of fermentation, which is a process of energy formation that existed for organisms on the planet before oxygen came into the environment. So our cells have this capacity, but it takes a while to transition from respiration to fermentation. And what happens in cancer is many aspects of the environment damage respiration of cells gradually, not acutely, but gradually or chronically. And this then gives some of those cells an opportunity to reconfigure fermentation. And fermentation, then, the cells become fermentative. And all cancer cells are fermenters in one form or another. So you say, what is the fuel for fermentation? It turns out to be glucose and certain amino acids. And these diets target the glucose and these amino acids, and therefore it targets the cancer naturally.
And that was Dr. Thomas Seyfried from episode 56.
The second nominee is Rapamycin for Longevity by Dr. Matt Kaberlein.
I will say that I think that group of people who is really seriously talking about taking rapamycin, for healthy individuals to delay aging is pretty small. And in part, that's because there are some real side effects associated with high doses of rapamycin. We already talked about it's used as an immunosuppressant or at least an immune modulator. So there's concern certainly that rapamycin could have effects on immune function. And then the patients who take rapamycin to cause immunosuppression have other side effects. Now, none of them are really life-threatening, but some of them are unpleasant. So mouth sores is actually the dose-limiting toxicity usually for people taking rapamycin. But also some of them are potential health risks like increases in circulating triglycerides, potential issues with glucose homeostasis. Maybe another one that's more of a concern is defects in wound healing. So I think there is reason to be cautious about, if you're healthy, just going out and asking your physician to prescribe you rapamycin. My own view is that the lower doses that seem to have effects on aging parameters probably are not going to be as much of a concern with respect to these side effects. And that's certainly what our very initial data in dogs is suggesting. But I do think it's a little bit early to really seriously start talking about people taking rapamycin if they want to live longer or live healthier into old age. Having said that, I also think that it's probably a pretty good time to really start a discussion about a controlled clinical trial to actually look at this.
And that was Dr. Matt Kaberlein from episode 134.
The third nominee is Mimicking Caloric Restriction with Oxaloacetate by Alan Cash.
I wanted to do the same thing and see if it could mimic calorie restriction without having to eat a lot less. So we started with worms, and I put oxaloacetate into the agar of these worms and just let them live and counted them. Counts after counts after counts. They're microscopic. I mean, you can just barely see them with the eye. So I spent hours and hours and hours looking through a microscope counting worms. But the worms lived 25 to 50% longer. We then tried it in flies. The flies lived 25% longer. And then we tried it in mice. And I didn't want to wait 3 years to see if this was working. So Steve Spindler at UC Riverside came up with just a brilliant idea of screening for calorie restriction mimetics, looking at gene response. So I thought, well, we could raise a control group that ate what they wanted. We could raise a calorie-restricted control group and then we could raise a group on oxaloacetate and, give them as much as they wanted to eat. And then in about 3 months, we could take some of their tissue and look and see how the genes are responding. And when we did that, we had a 99% correlation with calorie restriction and oxaloacetate. I mean, they were almost identical.
And that was Alan Cash from episode 52.
The fourth nominee is Non-Exercise Active Thermogenesis, NEAT, by Sal DiStefano.
Frequency of exercise may be more important if you're looking at longevity and long-term health and even cognitive function than simple intensity. And I'll give you a simple example. When they look at the world's blue zones, areas of the world where there's a disproportionate amount of people that live past 100, along with that incredible cognitive function, rates of dementia and Alzheimer's are quite low in these populations. They compare these different parts of the world and try to find commonalities. And one of the commonalities is activity, but it's not intense activity. These people aren't going out and doing CrossFit or competing in triathlons or doing anything crazy. It's just frequent daily movement. It's daily activity at low to moderate levels of intensity. And as a trainer, I can say that that's 100% true for everybody. I could take a client who's deconditioned and I can train them every single day at a low intensity. I mean, I could take someone at a very low intensity every single day, but I would not be able to take that person through a maximal intensity workout just once a week. Just once a week would set them over the edge and would not be that effective. And so my advice to people who are looking to just improve their creativity, how they think, the sharpness of their minds, would be rather than looking for that super intense workout, move a little bit every single day. That will make a much bigger impact than going for your hardcore 1 or 2 day a week type workouts where you're during the week you're working and then on the weekend you become a weekend warrior and go beat yourself up at the gym.
And that was Sal DiStefano from episode 125. And for Best Physical Vitality Hack, the award winner is NEAT, that is Non-Exercise Active Thermogenesis, presented by Sal DiStefano. Look, Ma, no hands. This is probably one of the happiest exclamations that any kid can make. It implies a sort of mastery by its very simplicity. If, as a kid, you can make something work without training wheels and tools and levers and flashing lights and the use of your hands, well, at that point, you've really got it. And something about this less is more vibe carries on even when we think about improvements to our own brain. Tech is amazing, pharmacology is powerful, but what if we could just use our brain to change our brain?
In the category of Best Endogenous Cognitive Performance Hack, the first nominee is Hypnosis by Dr. David Spiegel.
The real issue is not that people lose their will and they can't disagree, but they're less likely to. We've all had that it seemed like a good idea at the time experience, and you look back and say, why in the hell did I do that? Johnny said, do it, so I did it. We're social creatures. So to some extent, we all suspend our critical judgment. In hypnosis, you do more of that. You're more likely to suspend critical judgment, and that's why in these stage shows, a football coach will try to dance like a ballerina and make a fool of himself. It means that uncomfortably, sometimes people will do things that later on they look at and regret, or it's just plain wrong. So it is possible for people to be influenced to do bad things under hypnosis. If they're hypnotizable and it's not from their point of view that bad anyway, they're more likely to do it. But it doesn't mean that people can't say to hell with you. There's a famous story of Charcot, the great French neurologist, demonstrating hypnosis. Typically in those days, the sort of routine things like inducing and ending hypnosis were done by lower level people, and he would come in and the subject had been hypnotized. And so his students decided after he left that this very pretty young woman would have one more suggestion, which was she was getting ready to go to bed and would take off her clothes. And she opened her eyes and told them to go to hell and walked out of the room. So there are limits, but hypnosis sometimes extends the limits.
And that was Dr. David Spiegel in episode 141.
The second nominee is Holotropic Breathing by Dr. James Eierman.
With holotropic breathwork, you start off with a little bit of orientation. We give the graph map. So you create a mental set that sort of allows various experiences, because it does make a difference about whether you allow stuff to happen or not, and you don't think you're going nuts. In other words, my 11,000 patients was not a controlled study with 11,000 people not doing it with just music or whatever, or something alternative like, some type of creative arts therapy as an active placebo control. But it's a pretty good indicator that this kind of experience, while it does lead to crunchy places, Dante's various circles in Inferno are not really pleasant places to be, and you can go there. You can go to these places, but they resolve. It's very freeing to let go of the ghosts of the past or the various scorpions that have stung you and are currently stinging you.
And that was Dr. James Eierman from episode 89.
The third nominee is Intentional Habit Formation by Dr. Jen Lebrecht.
Now, once you've established goals, one of the best ways to maintain long-term behavior is to form proactive habits, positive habits for good behavior that you would like to maintain. But the great thing is that once you've established strong habits, once you've repeated a behavior consistently in a stable context, it's important that the context is stable for a long enough time, those goals become irrelevant. So even if you're not super motivated, even if you're tired, if you're going through a stressful time, if it's finals, that becomes irrelevant because you've formed this kind of default program of performing this behavior that's good for you. And we found that people can form habits for things that you wouldn't think of as performed frequently, but they do it every single time that they're in that context. So one of my favorite studies out of our lab looks at people's habits for eating popcorn when they're at the movies. You certainly don't go to the movies every day, but these are people for whom when they go to the movies, they eat popcorn every time. And they have formed habits for that. And it's actually a great study. They gave people fresh popcorn, one group of participants fresh popcorn, and another group of participants stale popcorn. And they showed that for those people who had strong habits to eat popcorn at the movies, they ate just as much stale popcorn as fresh popcorn. Isn't this great? Because once you've established strong habits, your goals are essentially irrelevant.
And that was Dr. Jen Lebrecht in episode number 109.
The fourth nominee is Lucid Dreaming by Dr. Deirdre Barrett.
Actually, it's easier to influence our dreams in just about any way other than lucidity, which is about the hardest, probably because it requires that prefrontal activation that most dreaming doesn't have. So if you're trying to problem solve in a dream, it's actually much more efficient to simply tell yourself as you're falling asleep, I want to dream a useful solution to X, and kind of repeat that over and over and visualize something associated with it. And when people do that with really simple problems, in some of my research, I found that about, in the course of 1 week of trying that, about half of people will have a dream on the topic of their problem, and about half of those will have a dream that solves it. And it's not that high as problems get more and more difficult, but the 50% will dream on the topic seems to hold up.
And that was Dr. Deirdre Barrett from episode 59. And for Best Endogenous Cognitive Performance Hack, the award goes to Intentional Habit Formation as presented by Dr. Jen Lebrecht. Improving the human mind with technical gadgetry has been happening for so long that we sometimes forget that it's not brand new. Because once we get used to an upgrade, that tech gets so interwoven into the fabric of human culture that to get by without it seems primitive. Perhaps the greatest technology ever invented by modern humans was writing, the original memory booster. A blind person's cane or an elderly person's bifocal seem so normal now that it's easy to forget that these are the technical precursors of today's retinal implants and fMRI machines.
In the category of Best Performance by Technological Gear, the first nominee is Self-Quantification with the Aura Ring by Dr. Petteri Latela.
We developed plenty of different kind of prototypes, but eventually we developed a prototype on the pulse oximeter, measuring from the fingertip, and we found out that actually the data from there is very good in quality. And then we started developing a prototype. Then we came up with the idea a few years back that, okay, why don't we make it as a ring? And of course, that time, no one believed that it's doable because even the CPU chips, which has the Bluetooth functionality and so on, they were completely too big. So the first kind of prototypes were very big.
More like brass knuckles than a ring.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then fortunately, components started to develop and they were smaller sizes coming and we were maybe the first ones to apply them. And eventually that supported us to make it work as a ring as well. And of course, the main thing is that what's happening inside, how we can access the necessary biosignals and combine all that or process the information there in the ring. So the main thing is that we get the pulse waveform and also the pulse amplitude variation, which is a reflection of blood pressure variation as well. So we sample in 250 samples per second and we get the full drawing of the pulse waveform, every detail of it.
And that was Petteri Latela from Overdose Edition number 4.
The second nominee is Orthodontic Neurology by Dr. Anthony Sims.
And if you had asked me 12 years ago what Tourette's was, it was way over my head. I wouldn't have known what to do or what to say. So I brought this gentleman in, and he had one of the most severe cases that you've ever seen. We decided to test him out. It was a Friday afternoon, tested him out, and literally all of his tics stopped. And I was just as surprised as he was. I couldn't just go to any physician and say, look what we can do. You have to know the mechanism. That's what took me down this pathway of studying for almost a year and a half. I went to the University of Maryland Medical Library just about every day after work and tried to find where this mechanism was. They kept saying it's in the basal ganglia, in the basal ganglia, in the basal ganglia. And for 6 months, I'm looking for something in the basal ganglia, and nothing worked. We looked at the basal ganglia inside out, upside down, and couldn't find it. And then I decided, well, what is my nerve? The nerve that I work with, which is actually the trigeminal nerve. And therefore, I started looking at the trigeminal nerve. And the amount of connections that the trigeminal nerve actually has, it is unbelievable.
And that was Dr. Anthony Sims in episode 112.
The third nominee is Brain Implants versus Epilepsy by Dr. Brett Wingeier.
There's a lot of stuff that happens early on in a seizure that you can detect. You can see that happening. In some ways, a seizure, it's like a brain cramp. Same way, if you're about to have a muscle cramp, you can feel it coming on. You feel that something's off. You can see that in the brain signals seconds or minutes before a seizure. And that gives you the chance to stimulate, to try to stop that seizure, which is pretty amazing. It's pretty subtle, which is one of the powerful things about the technology. If you look at how a defibrillator works, it's like a kick in the chest. The brain is more sensitive. It doesn't take as much, so patients don't even feel it. It's some very short, very small electrical pulses, but it's enough to disrupt the seizure activity that's starting. That's one of the key things about epilepsy, actually. The brain is really, really good at maintaining homeostasis. There's just the right amount of positive and negative feedback at exactly the right time. And with a healthy brain, it's actually pretty hard to derail it. Your physiology will sacrifice a lot of other things to keep your brain healthy. But in epilepsy, there's part of the brain that doesn't have that right kind of feedback mechanism anymore. And instead, it has too much positive feedback. So stuff cycles and cascades in that neural activity gets more and more out of control. The really crappy thing about epilepsy is there's that kind of bad positive feedback, but then in the course of the disease, there's bad positive feedback too, because each one of those seizures causes just a little bit of neurological damage to that chunk of brain, and the response to that is that it makes it even worse. So if you study epilepsy, you say seizures beget seizures. In a lot of people, it gets worse and worse over time, and that's why it's super important to get in there and try to treat it when you can.
And that was Dr. Brett Wingeier in episode number 194.
The fourth nominee is Virtual Reality versus Social Anxiety Disorder by Dr. Eva Zisk.
People with social anxiety disorder would be working with a therapist to do kind of repeated exposure trials. Let's just say a very simple analogy is people with spider phobia. They might first be exposed to a picture of a spider and then maybe play with plastic spider and then maybe watch a little spider walking around, then maybe handle that spider and then the spider might get bigger. So this is quite similar with social anxiety and exposure therapy for that, where people would be placed in social situations to be able to see that nothing bad happens. However, the problem with that is we can't actually control, we can't influence what happens on the other side of that. So we can put people in these situations, but we can't guarantee the patient others won't judge them or that others won't react negatively to them, which can be obviously a little bit of a problem if it does happen that way, and then that can actually confirm the person's original fear. So this is where virtual reality exposure therapy can be very, very useful, where we can actually simulate a social environment through having people be immersed in kind of a virtual world.
And that was Dr. Eva Zisk in episode 178. The envelope, please. And in the category Best Performance by Technological Gear, the award goes to Brain Implants Used to Fight Epilepsy, presented by and designed by Dr. Brett Wingeier. Okay, so that was it for episode number 201 of Smart Drug Smarts. Thank you for hanging out with us until the very end. You can find the links to this episode, everything we talked about here, which as you know is a bunch of previous episodes. You can find a whole lot of links up at smartdrugsmarts.com/201. I think that we'll probably finish off the Cognito Awards with a little mini episode in a couple of days and then go to episode number 202. We'll be back to the normal format next week. That is the plan. Got a lot of brain-relevant interviews coming down the conveyor belt, so I want to start popping these off, clearing some room for next year's episodes. Thanks again to those of you who have been writing in with episode recommendations. Super, super handy, and keep them coming. But I will see you back here in just a couple of days. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. And last but certainly not least, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. The 2017 Cognito Awards have been brought to you by Axon Labs, Vitamunk, and the team behind Smart Drug Smarts. And yes, in case you're wondering, all rights reserved. But drop us an email and we'll see what we can do.